Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to my podcast, Don't Get a Therapist Yet. And today I am very honored to have a very special guest. His name is Paul Grantham, and he's a consultant clinical psychologist. Now, Paul, there's a lot more to you than that. So, would you like to tell the audience a little bit more about yourself?
Sure, thanks very much for that, Wendy. I'm, as you say, a consultant clinical psychologist. I'm based in Sussex, UK. I hold an honorary chair in clinical psychology, and I run a training organization as well called the Skills Development Service, which can be accessed via skillsdevelopment.co.uk.
Yes, and I am a customer of that service, and it is a really excellent training organization. And I really enjoyed the training that you supply, Paul. So I just want to, just let the audience know that how good and how excellent the service is. And I also know colleagues who've been as well and have said the same thing.
Right.
There you go.
Okay. Thank you very much.
You're very
Thank
welcome. And today, the topic we've chosen, because I understand it is a special interest of yours. So, why is it that you're interested in our topic, motivation?
I guess I've been involved and interested in this for a number of years. Now, I guess it comes from two separate sources. One is a personal one. I have had a decades-long challenge with my weight. And like so many people who are trying to deal with that, I have gone on various diets. I've lost weight. I then, of course, have regained it as well. And I guess that part of my interest in that historically came from that. I think as well, I was quite struck by the issue with regards to my clients too. And I think particularly with the fact, and I know at one level this sounds sort of crazily self-evident, but it's important to say it really. When my clients come with particular problems, to be honest with you, what they could do, which would be helpful and help to improve the situation, is typically not rocket science. And in many instances as well, they even know what it is. But they just have a terrible issue doing it. Or some actually have not so much an issue of doing it, they have more of an issue of keeping doing it. So they do it for a period of time, but then it drifts back again and so on and so forth. And I know that's been something which is in various ways, shapes and forms, being quite a pressing issue for many of my clients. So I have an interest in that from that angle as well.
Yeah. So for you, I think it's a key issue, isn't it? It's a key issue. And sometimes before we even start, doing the therapy and going through certain research and protocols, you're sort of asking that fundamental question: what is their motivation for actually, sort of following through with those goals, really? And then the second part, as you said, is more about what maintains those
Yeah,
goals as well. Okay.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so, what do you think you need to get started in actually looking at motivation as a key issue?
Um, I'm well, it really depends on where you're starting with this. I mean, if you're starting with yourself, for instance, then at least there's a part of you that wants to change. And we'll come back to that particular point in a minute. But I guess I ought to also say that that is not always the case for clients. So sometimes clients seek out help because they want to change. But there are other instances where clients will be seeking help either because they have been mandated, and that's sort of the criminal justice system example most commonly, um, or alternatively, they might be under pressure from family members or from partners. So, although they come along for help, actually, the reason why they're there is somebody else thinks that they've got a problem that they ought to do something about, but they don't themselves. So I guess that for me, the key starting point is, I suppose to put it bluntly, to find out how my client defines their problem. Um, and um, and you might say, well, what happens if they don't see themselves as having a problem at all? To which my reply would be, whether it's something that comes from them or whether it's something that comes from somebody else, they are not happy with their status quo. They're not happy with the way they are at the moment. I mean, there will be some who will say, I really wanted to do X and I can't do it. But there'll be other people who will define their problem in a different way. So I've certainly had clients, for example, who will define their problem as being to stop having a nagging family. And that's fine. I'll come back to that later on. That's fine. But we need to find something to begin with, which the client, which is motivational for the client to do something about, even if they and I, or they and their family, might actually have very different definitions of what that is. But nonetheless, they are not happy with their status quo, really. So that's for me the key starting point, and it's the same for us. If we want to change, we need to focus on what it is that this creates how this creates a problem for us, really. Does it stop us doing certain things? Does it make us feel bad? Do we aspire to certain things and we're not getting them and we feel frustrated for that particular reason? And these broadly speaking, fall into two categories. And I think this is worth reflecting on as well, really, which is all of us only get motivated to do anything if either we're currently experiencing something which we want to get rid of, or alternatively, there's something that we want, we haven't got, and would like to have. Or to put that in a slightly different way, we've got to be in a situation where we feel that our current status quo is not sufficient. It's not viable. It's not creating contentment or happiness. And I think that's the first starting point in many ways.
Mm. And I think what is really good that you're defining the problem with the client, aren't you? You're being very clear about what brings you here, what is the
Yeah,
problem, and agreeing that. And that's a very
yeah,
good way to start.
yeah,
I think that's
yeah.
really, very important. And for people who are listening, to be very clear about what their
Yes,
problem is and what it is
yes.
that they're trying to work on. So, yeah, very, very good.
I mean, to give you just another example of how you can go down the wrong route with this, I have recently had a client who's who would define the problem well, they were wanting help with their 14-year-old son, and they were defining the problem that he had as not being willing to get out of bed. And and this person said to me, I repeatedly try and get him to do it. I'm shouting at him all the time, and I'm trying to tell him to get out of bed, and he won't get out of bed. Um, and yet, from the young person's perspective, the first thing to actually say is that he didn't see the problem in that way whatsoever. So it was almost like his mother in this particular instance was talking a different language. Or as I often say, or use as a metaphor, this can be a bit like trying to teach your dog how to windsurf. I might think it's wonderful to have a windsurfing dog. I think it would give me a lot of status. I think it would enhance his doggy life. It would increase his repertoire of skills, give us something to talk about to other people. From my dog's perspective, it's a different planet, a different universe. And that unfortunately can crop up very commonly when we take it upon ourselves to try and motivate someone else. I don't want to make this sound like it's an insurmountable obstacle. It isn't. But if you choose to focus on the wrong thing, you can get into a tug of war. And generally speaking, with most people we can get into a tug of war with, they are probably, particularly if it's something which is well bedded in, probably they can outlast a siege longer than we can. So yeah, this whole thing about, you know, discontent with the status quo from the other person's perspective, really crucial, because if you miss that, you're not going to get anywhere. Yeah.
Yeah, and like you say, sometimes in therapy and CBT, they're very clear on, this is the protocol for depression or anxiety or OCD and everything like
Yeah.
that. But there's a step before that, which I think is very
Yes.
crucial, like you're saying, to understand, like you say, what the problem is and what's the motivation behind
Yeah.
that. What is it they want to achieve in therapy,
Yeah.
and also for ourselves as well.
Yes, sure. For ourselves too. Yeah.
So I love the metaphor. It's really good. I've got this image
Right.
of this dog surfing, so it's really good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can I just have one additional thing about defining this thing that we want? Um, Particularly if we have got an existing problem. It's very common for us or our clients to define what we want in terms of what's called a negative goal, which is basically the absence of the problem. So I'd like not to be eating so much. My depressed client says I'd like not to be depressed. My client who's got a substance misuse problem says I don't want to be using drugs. These are very, very common. There is a difficulty with them, though, which is you can't focus on or concentrate on the absence of something. Because to think about the absence of something immediately draws your attention back to the very thing that you want to give up. And for a whole variety of reasons, that can at the very least hold us back, and in some instances can actually guide us back to the very problem we want to avoid. So I think another key question, if you find yourself with negative goals like that, the next key question to actually ask yourself or to ask your client is, what do you want to be doing instead? What do you want to be feeling instead? What do you want to be thinking instead? So that there's a focus then on what the presence is of something else. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Paul, and I get that totally. And it's quite easy, isn't it, just to suddenly, if the client comes up with that negative goal, to go with it. But you're saying it's really important to change the language and the focus
Yeah.
on is what they want rather than what they don't want. Yeah, that
Yeah.
makes a lot of sense. Yeah, very good
Yeah.
point to make. Okay, and I'm just wondering, do you feel that there's a difference between individuals, that people are just generally, some people are more motivated than others? I mean, what's your experience on that?
Um, this is really quite a difficult one to answer, really, because um, to sort of make a sort of an associated point with this, everybody's circumstances are different. So, and our circumstances make a big difference to how motivated we are. That's obviously one thing. Just to give you a very obvious extreme example here, I don't know what the situation is now, but certainly about 10 years ago, it was found that the most common point that long-term smokers gave up cigarettes was at the time of their first admission to hospital with a smoking-related illness. And that those circumstances are different from the circumstances of a 16-year-old who's smoking and who, first of all, starts off with no health problems, feels very fit, and also on top of that has this really bizarre belief that they're invincible.
Mm.
So circumstances make a big difference, and that would be crazy to ignore. But I think it's fair to say that um, people do vary, I think, according to what their confidence is, and what I guess psychologists would often call their perceived self-efficacy, which is what the person's history is and experience is of basically doing things, of dealing with challenges, overcoming challenges, um, taking action in the face of things that they don't like. And people do vary on that enormously. So I don't think it necessarily means that people are different necessarily in how much they would like to change something. But I do think people can start off being quite variable in terms of their belief about being able to do something about it. And there I do think that there's variability. But I would like to just simply say I don't think that's fixed at all. I think that that is quite flexible, and I think having experiences of what might be called incremental change are important in that, whether we do that ourselves or whether we do that with our therapist. But I think we need to have experiences of discovering that we can actually do things that make a difference. So that I think is important very often in helping folks to actually do that. The other area which I often find quite interesting is I will sometimes have clients where, well, I could even take myself as an example of this really, which is where I think they have a strong sense of self-efficacy in other areas of their life, but they don't have that sense of self-efficacy, for example, in the particular area that they wish to change. And indeed, I think for some people, what is a strength in one area is potentially a weakness in another area. So, for instance, I can take myself as a personal example of this. I think I have a strong sense of self-efficacy in all sorts of areas of my life, but I will share a secret with you. Food and exercise are not two of them. Um, and in a peculiar way, I think my strong sense of self-efficacy in an area, for instance, of study and persevering with study, which of course involved a lot of sitting, in fact, and staring at the screen or writing things down, actually meant or had some negative effects with regards to self-efficacy with things like exercise, for example, or spending time on preparing and eating quality food. So, I think that's to be borne in mind. But I would say to anyone who has doubts about their ability to do something, even when they want to do something about it, about this thing, is to cast their mind around and to see whether they can, first of all, identify other areas in their life where they have shown self-efficacy, where they have shown resilience, where they have shown perseverance, and where they've shown themselves to be skilled. Because sometimes it's easier to transfer that existing ability in one area to another area, even though they might not have done it so far.
Mm. And that's such a powerful message there, Paul, and so good for people to hear and to listen to, because there's hope there, isn't there? Even if you're weak in that area, you're sort of turning it around and seeing the situation from a different perspective is very, very powerful. So yeah, it's a really good point there. That's very, very good. So I'm just my next question is, what doesn't work in trying, to work with getting people motivated? What can go wrong?
Well, certainly telling off does not seem to work. Whether you're telling yourself off or whether you are telling somebody else off for it, it doesn't seem to work. why doesn't it work? Partly because individuals might agree with you, and you might agree with yourself that you want to do something about it, but it doesn't solve the how to issue. There's a lovely comedy sketch which is written by the American comedian Bob Newhart, which is a simulated therapy session, and where a client comes to him and says that she's got a problem, which is her fear that she's going to be locked up in a box. And he says, I'm going to just say 2 words to you, and I want you to concentrate on them very carefully. And she says, what are those 2 words? He says, stop it. And that's the issue. I mean, it just doesn't work. And I think the second thing to say is that particularly, I think, if you're talking about something that you want to change or which you're trying to help somebody else to change, which has been standing, is embedded into their life, maybe it's very familiar for possibly years, if not decades, just telling people to not do it, even repeatedly, is not going to work. And indeed, what then happens, of course, is if you repeatedly tell yourself that, or somebody else repeatedly tells yourself that, you go into siege mentality. Therapeutically, what will happen therapeutically? If you do that therapeutically, first of all, what will happen is clients just come up with loads of yes, buts. Yes, but it's easy for you to say that. Yes, but I'd like to, but I can't, etc. And then, of course, a stage beyond that is to just disengage, which is, therapeutically more self-evident because the client doesn't come back. But, or can I say they stay there if they have to, but they just go through the motions. Or what simply happens is that they, or you yourself, if you do this, basically give up. You give up. You've tried it. You tried turning yourself off. You tried repeatedly telling yourself you should do it. And there comes a point where it's painful to experience that. And, we have got quite a lot of control over what we do with our own heads. So, consciously or unconsciously, we just decide we're not going to do it any longer. So that's certainly one thing I can't emphasize strongly enough. Telling people not to do it or just to stop it, and repeatedly telling them not to do it or stop it. I think other things which are common mistakes to make are to assume that change will occur in one go, and the first time you try and do it. This is particularly true for behavioral things like, changing your eating style. But I think it's also true for psychological problems like anxiety and depression. The things that you have to do in order to create a change, you might not manage it, or you might not be able to keep it up the first time you do it. This shouldn't be a surprise. When was the first time you ever went out in a car and someone told you what to do that was teaching you how to drive, and my goodness, you managed to do it first time? Actually, you needed to fail a number of times. I've got a situation at the moment, which is that I'm currently getting coaching for my tennis, and I just hope my coach does not get bored with taking me through the same things, really. Can I just say that that's an interesting metaphor or parallel, because my coach doesn't do this, but I know that therapists, if they're not necessarily producing the results from something that they're doing, tend to assume that they ought to be doing something else additionally. I
Mhm.
don't think in therapy there's necessarily the degree of recognition that there needs to be, that actually movement forward often occurs by repeatedly doing the same thing.
Mhm.
Um, so that would be that I think is a common mistake. Thirdly, I think that um, trying to do things on your own is notoriously difficult. I appreciate that not everything that people want to get motivated to do, or which we might be where, or people which you might be might be working with to help them to become more motivated, can necessarily access other people who are trying to grapple with this. But we've got very good evidence indeed that actually doing things with someone else makes an enormous difference. And people who say, no, this is me that's got to do this, me and no one else, it's my responsibility. I don't know anyone else without even asking or trying to find out. I don't know anyone else, or I don't want anybody else to know about this, will actually find it more difficult. We know, for example, just again to take a silly example here, but quite a powerful one, we know that people who join a gym for their New Year's resolution are 3 times more likely to still be using it come the next Christmas if they've joined with one other person.
Mhm.
So that not doing things alone is a big plus. And finally, although there's other things that can get in the way, the other thing I think that's really quite important is to recognize that um, basically that motivation is fluid. And what I mean by that is, I do think it is a shame that very often people decide what they should be motivated by, and that there's good motivators and there are bad motivators. And that motivator will carry them along the whole journey. In actual fact, um, I would argue quite strongly that especially initially, basically whatever gets you through the night is helpful. So whatever motivates you to start the process off is helpful. Don't rule it out or say I shouldn't be feeling I'm doing it for that reason. I should be doing it for this other reason. Try not to get caught up in that, and to recognize that motivation for doing things changes over the process of change. Again, let me just give you a brief example of this. I had a client who was wanting to get healthier. And one of the ideas that they had for getting healthier was to go along to the gym. They didn't want to go along to the gym, but they were fed up with their partner telling them to go and do it. And I said, well, what do you think of that? And they said, well, I don't think that should be why I'm going to the gym. I ought to be going to the gym because I want to be healthier, not because my partner is repeatedly telling me. And he said, I've got a friend who tells me that actually the reason why they go to the gym is because it makes them feel good afterwards. So I said, well, that's really interesting. I said, um, do you, when you've gone to the gym, feel good afterwards? He said, no, not at all. He said, usually I'm aching all over the place. I hate it. I dread going. So I said, well, that's not going to work for you then at this stage, is it? And I said, I appreciate that, ultimately you don't want to be going along to the gym because of pressure from your partner. But is that going to be enough to start you off? And they said, well, to be honest with you, to get any respite from my partner on this would be a plus. So, yes. And what was really interesting about that is I remember meeting up with this client about 3 months later. And by that stage, they said, if I don't go to the gym at least twice a week, my body feels it's missing something. Um, and what's interesting about that is that the motivation's clearly changed. And that's why, just to put a bit more flesh on the bones on this, that's why I wouldn't be too worried to begin with about this distinction between extrinsic and intrinsic motivation. People say intrinsic motivation is better. Ultimately, it is, but I wouldn't see it as a deal breaker if you haven't got it. And in some instances, we actually only do certain things on an ongoing basis for extrinsic motivational reasons. So just be a bit more forgiving, be a bit more flexible, take whatever it is that exists at the moment, which is helpful for you, rather than having preconceived ideas about, why I should be doing something. And if I don't feel it at the moment, then I won't do it at all. Yeah.
That's a really good example, Paul, and I love the story, and I'm sure a lot of people can relate to that. Is it okay if you just explain the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic, if I can say it?
Yeah, sure. Intrinsic,
Motivation.
yeah. So extrinsic motivation is the idea that we get motivated to do things because of things that are external to us. Things like, well, we only go to work because we get given a salary by somebody. We only go and work because somebody praises us. Intrinsic motivation is where we do things because of what are basically internal values. So they're things like it gives me pleasure. It's things like I find it very satisfying. It's things like it makes me proud of myself. Those are our internal things. And there's a general assumption in the psychology literature, and I don't want to dispute that, it exists, but basically always argues that we should be going for intrinsic motivation. And my thoughts about that is, yes, I agree in a perfect world, but I would also argue that we don't live in a perfect world. And I think it also, in many ways, doesn't capture the fine detail of motivation and how it changes over time. So yeah, but those are the primary differences. Things that are internal to us, that are there, part of who we are, and things that we get from an external source.
That's really interesting. And would you actually have that discussion with a client, or perhaps for yourself, you could maybe write those things down? What do you think about that idea?
I generally speaking think it brings us back again to that original question I raised at the beginning, really, which is to have some focus on what it is that you want from doing this. What I typically don't raise it with clients because, if the client has got something which is motivating for them already, then I want to run with it. And I don't want to introduce the idea that there are different motivations. But if I've got a client who comes along with a belief that the motivation which they're most conscious of is extrinsic, and they think that they shouldn't do anything unless it's intrinsic, then yes, I will have a conversation with them about it. As I often say to my clients, easily 50% of the things I do on an ongoing basis are actually to please somebody else. Easily 50%. Why do I empty the kitchen bin on a regular basis? Do I really think it needs emptying? No, but I know my wife is going to be unhappy if I don't empty it. So, someone could come to me and say, Paul, you really ought to be emptying that bin for intrinsic reasons, for your desire to have a clean kitchen. And I would say, get a life. We do things for a whole range of reasons, and there's nothing necessary. If we're doing things which are related to extrinsic motivation only, and that is causing us some ongoing, if it's not working, if we're not motivated by it enough, or if it causes us some sort of internal distress, then we might look at it again. But I wouldn't decry it automatically. Be flexible. Be flexible. Yeah.
It's really interesting, and a great example that I think everybody can relate to. Who takes out the bins in your household? Yeah.
Yeah.
And the reason why is really
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah, that'd be a great question to ask. Actually, people
Yes.
go back and
Yeah.
ask,
Yeah.
okay, so why am I? Who is taking the pins out, and
Yeah.
what's their motivation? Is it
Yeah.
intrinsic or
Yeah.
extrinsic? Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a really good example. Yeah. So there's, I mean, this is something you started as well. I don't know, it's made particularly clear at the beginning. This is your expertise motivation, and a lot of it is based
Yes.
on a lot of research and a lot of study
Yes.
that you've
Yes.
done as well. So it's very important to make that point. And but I just want to move on now to a very topical subject, which is AI. Now, do you think AI has made a difference to motivation? And do you think people have become lazier as a result of all these AI systems?
Gosh, where do I even begin to start on this? Um, at one level, AI is a resource, a tool. The next question is the degree to which we become dependent on it, the degree to which we lose our own skill set because of it, and the final question, which is often not asked, is does it matter? So let me just give you an example of this, and let's take calculators. I remember when I was a kid, which was so long ago, it was before calculators were even being used in schools. My teacher had a real issue with calculators. In fact, if I remember it correctly, at some point, either just after I'd left school, maybe, it was still the case that calculators were banned in exams. And the idea was that people would not learn or be motivated to learn their times table. They wouldn't be capable of doing mental arithmetic, and so on and so forth. And lo and behold, that's turned out to be true. And for a lot of people, if I was to say, tell me what 7 times 9 is, they would not be able to tell me off the top of their head. The next question is does it matter? And I think most people would probably say at this stage, it would be nice if I had that skill, but it is not crucial or central to my life. And I suppose at this point in time, I have a similar attitude towards AI. For me, the touchstone for anything really, in terms of whether it's a problem, is whether it is interfering with functioning, whether it's interfering with functioning. So let me give you an example of not so much necessarily just AI, but digital resources. I remember when internet dating first started, and I knew quite a few people who had either actually never dated or they'd only dated with people that they'd known at school or college for a long period of time, where they all automatically knew that they had common interests, and or they had been in a long-term relationship and now they weren't and were having to get back into the dating game and found it very, very anxiety provoking and didn't know what to do. And I know a few people who said that they were saved by internet dating. The internet dating enabled them to anonymously, because I think certainly to begin with, didn't even have to show your photo to begin with, that anonymously they could have conversations with people. They could try things out because there's a lot of experimentation that needs to go in dating behavior, particularly if you've not done it for a long time. And they could do all of that before they got into a situation where they would meet the person face to face and then discover whether they had sufficient in common to take it further. And that, to me, would be an example of a digital resource which was a really helpful stepping stone for many people. Let's have a look at the other extreme, which is an issue that has currently been obviously in the news recently, which is individuals who have got AI girlfriends. Now, this is really interesting because my first thought is I'm not against that. The question is does this facilitate, well, what would in CBT terms be described as facilitating approach or facilitating avoidance? In other words, is this being used by people as a stepping stone to then meeting people in real life or not? Because if it doesn't, if in a sense people get stuck with that in inverted commas, then it becomes a problem, because there is no way, shape, or form, I think, that anyone would describe an AI partner as being sufficiently emotionally and socially satisfying in comparison with a real life person. However, in a sense, we already know this. And I find it very interesting that people's, what I hate to say it, but what I would often describe as people's knee-jerk reaction to AI is they've actually missed a process which has occurred before this, and which actually we know, partly because it was done so exclusively and for such a long period of time, has created problems for people. And that was lockdown and its impact on social interaction. Now, what's really interesting, obviously, is during lockdown in COVID, people did still interact. They interacted like we are on a screen. I certainly knew people who were playing through the screen Trivial Pursuits. They were meeting up with friends and having online games with friends. But we know, particularly for young people, and of course, the whole issue of social interaction, social identity, sexual and romantic identity are all being formed during that particular period. Adolescents who went through that during COVID have major issues now, major issues. So it's the key reason, in my opinion, why social anxiety is so common. I think it's why, I mean, I know that adolescence is always a time of confusing identity, but I think identity issues are even more pronounced now in all sorts of ways. Of course, what do people do when they are wanting to find out who they are or to interact with people? They feel lonely. They think they're the only one. They try and find other people. How do you find other people? You find it through a screen. So there's a part of me which says that's actually an example of where a digital resource, whether it's AI or not, is making things worse. Mm. So I guess my position on this is, what effect does it have for individuals? In some instances, I would happily recommend it. Because I think it facilitates things. In other instances, it erodes skill set and actually makes problems worse. Mm-hmm. So rather than sort of automatically forming a universal opinion on it, I would look at it in the individual instance and think about, is this a resource which is helping to facilitate basically approach? Or is this a resource that I'm becoming increasingly and exclusively dependent on, which takes away my desire to do certain other things, in inverted commas, by myself or in real life? So sorry that that's such a long answer, but I think it's quite a complicated issue. It's a bit like saying, are chainsaws good or bad? Well, they're both. It depends on whether you use them to cut off your leg or not, really. And
not a good idea.
Not a good idea. And there are some people I don't think ought to touch chainsaws, me being one of them, by the way. But there are other people who find them an incredibly useful tool.
Yeah.
So
yeah. I think also, Paul, I think the other point you're making is it's asking the right question, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's asking the question, is this a useful behavior for you, and what is it you're getting from, or is there any kind of downside? And actually just asking those important questions helps people to really think about the actions and their motivations and their process rather than just doing it. You're really
Yes.
getting people to
Yeah.
reflect on their thinking and their behavior and their attitudes or something. So that's
Yeah.
what I'm picking up. um
Yeah.
very much so. And I love the example, and I remember that too. I remember calculators coming in and not being allowed to have one because they were so bad, weren't they? They were so
Yes. Oh, terrible, terrible things.
terrible.
Terrible things.
Yeah, yeah. Now it's sort of like, where's my, they're everywhere now. It's a really good example of
Yeah.
how people fear change in technology, and it
Yeah.
can be very overwhelming. But
Yeah.
sometimes it's also validating that as well, because there are downsides, and it's really
Of
important
course there are. Yeah.
keep on noticing those and making sure they are. And with the AI girlfriend, I really understand you can use it sort of as a sort of therapeutic tool to sort of communicate and practice those kind of starting relationships. That could be really, really good. But if you just only get stuck with the AI girlfriend, you never move on to a girlfriend.
Right.
The point you're
Right.
making is that there is a perhaps unhealthy limitation to there, because they're missing out on the joy of the human
Yeah.
interaction. Even though it
Yeah.
might be more
Totally.
challenging, it should be more satisfying.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Undoubtedly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. That's a really, really good answer. I really love that. Um, and you made another point earlier on about there's a difference between starting and
Yes.
continuing motivation, and there's almost like different strategies there. Are you okay to
Yes.
just explain that a little bit more and perhaps give some examples?
Yes. Okay. So, as I said, it's a common mistake to make to assume that motivation is static. It's actually fluid. What it is that motivates us changes. But in addition to that, what might be broadly termed the processes of motivation also change. So the first one, which in many ways I find, well, I do find it sad that it's the only one on the whole that tends to be focused on, which is getting going, starting things. And that's what, the vast majority of books are written about, and what people's main focus and interest actually is. However, there's a second step, which is broadly termed maintenance, which is keeping going.
Mm.
And coming back to Bob Newhart again, Bob Newhart has got a lovely quotation that I often try and remind my clients about, which is that giving up cigarette smoking is very easy. I have done it on many occasions. And people will undoubtedly say that about losing weight. Or I've got a client at the moment who says, "Oh, I'm back into my negative way of thinking again." They will have typically a crisis point. They will do something, usually with therapeutic help, which changes that, and that goes for a while, and then they sort of slip back again. And rather than, I was saying earlier on about having more than one go at something, rather than sort of basically picking themselves up and saying, right, time for the next go, then get stuck and then have to start all from scratch again, and so on and so forth. So the key thing, I think this whole issue of maintenance, which is an incredibly pressing issue in practically every area, certainly, I would say practically every area of potentially recurrent problem, whether we're talking about exercise, weight loss, whether we're talking about depression, whether we're talking about taking drugs or offending. Starting this is a very important process, but generally speaking, most people would not like to have their lives being ones of continuously having to revisit this.
Mm.
They would like to keep the change going. Now, that's a very different process. It's a very different process because it's about making a change into a habit. And what it is that helps to make things into habits is quite different from what it is that enables us to do something for the first time. So these are not easy things. Repetition and practice, two obvious things to some degree. I think what we now know, which is a bit of an issue, is that people have to practice things for a lot longer than they thought. Certainly to get to what's called the third stage, which I'll mention in a minute. But that repetition and practice, it's really useful to have a ritual attached to whatever it is that you're trying to change. I have a client at the moment who is now 7 months into daily practicing of mindfulness. Now, for me, what I find quite interesting about mindfulness is not to doubt its effectiveness, but to raise questions about how easy people find it to keep it up. And one of the ways of doing it, of course, is to go along to a regular group, which in itself is a ritual. But such groups might only meet once a week, for example. So you can create your own rituals. So this particular client of mine has identified a time, basically between coming out of the shower and getting dressed, of a morning when he will practice this. There's things that occur before that, alarm going off, getting out of bed, like to have a coffee first, goes into the shower, and there's things after that. There's the getting dressed, there's the going out and putting stuff in his car, etc., etc. But that's all part of his morning ritual. And generally speaking, if we can attach a change to an existing ritual, it helps maintenance. It helps maintenance, easier to do. And in a peculiar way, the more elaborate the ritual is, the better. We don't quite know why elaborate rituals are important. They've got something to do with the fact they're more memorable. Also, the detail of a ritual, I think, in many ways is a statement of its importance. If you have a think about religious rituals, they are quite detailed, and it's part of the significance of them that detail exists with the ritual. So you can have a look at that. I've mentioned trying to build in, if you can, continuing to do it with somebody else. All of those occur, and that's the maintenance stage. But this is a key thing to bear in mind. During that maintenance stage, you are probably still going to have to be conscious of doing this thing that you want to keep motivated to do. You need to keep it in the forefront of your mind, and you will need to be conscious of it. We then come to the third stage, which is often called exit, but which I prefer to call unconscious automation, which is where that repetition has occurred and has been embedded in your life for a sufficient amount of time that you do it automatically without thinking about it. And the most obvious example I think I would take with this is brushing your teeth. I don't have to think, when I brush my teeth in the morning, brush my teeth at night, I don't have to think about how to pick up the toothbrush. I don't have to think about how long I do it for. I don't have to think about how much toothpaste I put on the brush. Okay, I'm certain that when I was a kid and was being taught this by my parents on a daily basis, and I was in a maintenance stage with it, I had to keep remembering those things. But you get to a point where things become automatic, and they can become automatic. They can be automatic in a way whereby the issue doesn't even enter your consciousness. I used to be a smoker myself, maybe you guess because of the mention, but how long ago did I give up? I gave up 22 years ago.
Wow.
And what's really interesting about that is I happily am around smokers. Don't particularly like the smell, but I'm happily around smokers. I don't have the slightest inclination to wish to smoke. I can't, and I've been in a whole variety of circumstances, where it might be quite tempting to think, oh, I've got to have a cigarette. And I know some people that do that, don't they? They stop smoking, but I don't know, they get drunk or it's a special occasion and they'll have a cigarette. I've never had that. So that is now automatic for me. How long did it take to get to that point? Probably, I mean, longer than I would have hoped, but not that long. Because I remember being in that situation probably about 2 years after I gave up. I thought, oh, I've just been around smokers this evening and it never crossed my mind to have a cigarette. But it takes a long time. The point is, of course, by the time you get to that point, the chances of relapse are very low. Major change in personal circumstances might lead to relapse, but generally speaking, it's low. The chances of relapse during maintenance are higher because you're still having to consciously do it. Other examples, driving a car is another classic example. I mean, people don't, when you think about when you first learned how to drive or when you were driving, you had to consciously think about what you were doing with your hands and your feet and whatever. And then after you passed your test, you kept on having to remind yourself to do this. I think most people, when they drive now, if they've been driving for a number of years, do it near enough unconsciously. They're not thinking, I don't mean obviously literally, but they're not thinking about what it is they're doing. It's become automatic. So that's what we're aiming for. And to recognize to some degree where you are at in that process, because I know some people who have relapsed and it's hit them very hard. And they sort of had the belief, I was over that. I've been over that for years. How can I have been so stupid as to do such and such and so and so? And I usually ask people, you're clearly doing the thing that was helpful. Were you still having to remind yourself to do that? Were you still conscious of having to do that? They said, well, yeah. And I said, well, while that's there, you're not fully over things. So don't be so hard on yourself, because that is still a time when you can lapse. But the good news is that you can get back into that quite quickly, as long as you don't put too much significance on the actual lapse itself.
And again, that's another really good example of the three stages of motivation, as you're sort of saying, and for the person to ask themselves the question as where are they? Is it like a conscious or an unconscious action now? And that will really help them to assess where they are in their motivational journey. And perhaps, like you say, just be a little bit more encouraging if they do relapse, that this is part of the process and it's okay, because there's another process afterwards, which is the unconscious process. I don't think that's talked about hardly at all, Paul. It's a really good point. Totally agree with that. Okay. And I think the other point I just want to make is you are actually an author, and you've written a book about motivation, but you're also writing another book as well. Could you tell us a little bit more about your authoring-ship?
Right. I've published a number of books. I've published, I tend to largely write books which would be broadly described as either self-help books or therapy manuals. So they tend to be practical, tend to be divided up into sections. So there's a motivation workbook, which has exercises in it. All of these are available on Amazon, by the way, which has exercises in it and which addresses a number of the points that I've made today. I've also got a book on what's called solution-focused brief therapy, which is a particular way of working. And I guess for people who are not familiar with that as a sort of therapeutic way of working, what I would say is you don't have to be. It contains, and certainly this is the way the book is written, it contains a range of exercises which are based on solution-focused brief therapy, which you can use.
Mm.
and which which are useful adjuncts in all sorts of areas, but including motivation. It's often said, by the way, that solution-focused brief therapy is motivational interviewing with a bigger toolkit. Whether I would wish to be that strong on it, I don't know, but it certainly provides some additional ideas about motivation as well as working with other problems. I've also got a book. I've moved more into the personal development area in recent years, and I have a book out on procrastination. Gosh, where to even start with this greatly misunderstood, very common problem, by the way, very, very common problem. Greatly misunderstood, often seen as due to problems with time management. And in fact, it's got nothing at all to do with that, and time management won't solve the problem. It's actually got to do with something else, but I will say no more. I would say buy the book. It's called I Want to Stop Procrastinating Now. It's the name of the book. And I just published a book on imposter syndrome. I sort of published this for a couple of reasons. I think that, first of all, it's not exclusive to counselors and therapists, but there are a large proportion of counselors and therapists, I think, who suffer from it. I think that it is something which is often seen as a purely female problem, and although I can honestly say the research suggests that there is a gender difference on this, it is by no means exclusively a female problem. And I think there's a lot of books that have been published, a lot of articles that have been published on imposter syndrome. And the reason why I wrote this particular book, which again is a sort of how to overcome book, is because it struck me that the overwhelming majority of books that are written on imposter syndrome describe it and focus on causes and say very, very, very little, apart from increasing self-awareness, very, very little about what you can do to change it. And this book is very focused on specific exercises and techniques for directly addressing and changing imposter syndrome. And they all come from an evidence-based source.
Mm. And I think that's a really good point, Paul. I really want to emphasize that to people. You know, Paul is somebody who's very, very rigorous in your research, very evidence-based kind of philosophy. These are things that aren't just opinion. They are grounded in a lot of research into these areas, aren't they? And therefore, you know, you really are learning from an expert in these areas. And I will be certainly looking at your books and thinking which one to buy now, which one first, because I can see them as incredibly self-help resources for individuals. So thank you for making the effort to write all these books as self-help material, Paul. It's very much appreciated.
Can I just finally add, if anyone has got any questions at all in connection with this, they can email me directly.
Yes.
If they can email my company main address, which is info@sds-seminars.com. That's info@sds-seminars.com. And if you just put PAO in the subject line with my name, Paul Grantham, I'd love to hear from you, and we'll get back in whatever way I can help do.
Yeah, thank you for that, Paul. And just to let people know that these details will be in the show notes, so they can access, if they don't write it down, they can go back and access your contact details. And that's very generous of you to actually offer that service to people. I'm sure there'll be lots of people contacting you because there's so many topics of interest, as well as a motivational one that you've spoken about today. So thank you so much. And also, again, if anyone's interested in your training organization, they can also contact you there and find out what kind of training you offer as a result. Yeah. Okay. So Paul, on behalf of all the listeners, thank you so much for your amazing explanation, but also highly entertaining explanation of motivation. And I'll be thinking about the bins today. I can tell you that.
Well, thanks very much. It's been really enjoyable being here. Thank
I've
you.
enjoyed it so much. Thank you so much. And thank you
Thank
to
you.
everybody for listening.
Yes, thanks, folks.
Just have to hang on a minute. Whoops.